Well, hello everybody. It's Jason, zombie collector extraordinaire, and thought I'd do a live stream as I'm heading into work on this beautiful Indiana morning here in the month of May 2023, the year of our Lord. And I feel like I like to alternate topics, and some of them might be more. I don't know, politically charged. Some of them might just be deep thoughts. Some of them might just be observations. And this what this one's going to be. It's more like a nostalgic trip observation down memory lane that maybe some of you all will relate to, especially the of us of the 40s and 50s, maybe late 30s, but definitely us 40 and 50. The Gen Xers are basically in this situation. So that's weird. It just like cut out on me. Usually it keeps going. Okay. But anyways, and so recently I've been watching on Vice, the dark, it's called the dark of the 90s, or Dark Days of the 90s. I might have the name of the program wrong, but it's something about the dark days or the dark nights of the 1990s. And if you've seen that show, first of all, let me know what you think about it and below if you ever watched that show. I'm definitely interested in finding out what people think about that show. But I have been loving that show tremendously. And it's a 1 hour long episode, so they just talk about different topics in the 90s. They have there's the same people who do Dark Side of the Ring, which is the wrestling program, and I think they have the Dark Side of the Comedy. They have the Dark Side of the 90s. There we go. That's what it's called, Dark Side of the 90s. And they have a season 1 and 2, and they have all different kinds of topics. Now, I do find it interesting because they have modern day people, especially even younger people, probably who weren't even barely alive in the 90s, let alone grew up in the 90s, as sometimes the talking heads talking about, how things were so different back then, and basically in a negative way. And I find it interesting because if you ask people that are around our age, I would think most of us would be like, I wish we could go back to those times. But, they pick a lot of topics that are, nowadays would be even more controversial because of the world we live in and the political correct world we live in, and everything has to have an angle or a slant or a really one-sided perspective. So, even though, when I hear that kind of stuff, I just like, my mind tunes out while they're talking because it's just nonsense, because they're trying to paint it with rose-tinted glasses of today when it was not meant for that. Obviously, in the 90s, obviously it's a different time and different sensibilities, and I would say I wish we could go back to that, but unfortunately, it probably will never go back to those days. But, the one thing I will say is that I do find it interesting that the topics they have discussed, which is like the internet, like the Kurt Cobain in the 90s with grunge. They talk about hip hop, East Coast versus West Coast, Beanie Babies, about talk shows, about late night talk shows like Arsenio Hall. They are some great topics, and I find it to be fascinating. And I just really, really enjoy these type of like walk down memory lane. I don't know if y'all remember, like VH1 used to do like the 1990s, like kind of like in the year 2000s and the 80s, and they would do these like little 1 hour long episodes of each year in the 90s or each year in the 80s, and it was like, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like 1 hour episodes, and it was I liked it. It was nostalgic in that, even though it was back in the early 2000s they were doing that, and nowadays they're doing it on this, but they're doing a little bit more of the seedy underbelly of the 90s at sometimes as well. Like they'll talk about the Viper Room in River Phoenix, and about, let's see, Baywatch. They did one about Baywatch, which I thought was interesting. and oh about what's the one, the teenage show Saved by the Bell. And I just found these all things very interesting, very intriguing. You hear a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. You have some of the people involved with the shows. A lot of them are like producers and directors, writers. Some of them are the actual stars or musicians. They'll do something with musicians. So you do get a little bit from like a peek behind the curtain of the actual people involved, not like the professor of such and such at such and such state university who wants to try to tell you how terrible it was back then and how you should be ashamed for finding enjoyment from those things from back in the olden days. But I did find it very interesting. I was wondering for you guys, the Gen Xers essentially, you know, do you look back on the 90s with fond memories? Do you look back on it and enjoy growing up in the 90s? You know, starting out of your young adult life in the 90s or finishing up high school in the 90s or whatever the case may be. You know, what are some of your memories from that time? What are some of the things that you take away from? What were the music you were listening to? What was the movies you were watching? What were the programs you were watching? You know, what were some of the fads that you participated in? I think it'd be interesting, just because it's it's something that I enjoy looking back on with fond memories. And I mean, honestly, ever since the 90s, quite frankly, it's kind of just like been just a shit show, ever since. And it's sad to say that, but it really has been. And I wish there was, something that could be done about it, but more than likely there won't be, because it's not going to ever change. And I say that knowing that this is the truth. There'd be a snowball chance in hell. Is that the way it goes? That would ever change, But to answer the question I posed, I grew up and I loved the 90s. I love 90s hip hop. Big fan of 90s grunge. I was big into straight edge punk rock music, hardcore music back in the day. These are the music. I mean, I can name the bands and the groups, but if you know, kind of thing. So I'm not going to go down a laundry list. I remember back in the 90s, they will go into movie theaters and they never carded you in the movie theater. So I went to go see like all the Quentin Tarantino movies back in the 90s. So it was great. And I really liked all those. I always liked being able to go without being carded, going to see a movie in the 90s. I remember going to arcades in the 90s. They have big malls that had arcades upstairs or in the specific, areas of the mall where you could go and spend all your quarters playing arcades. I loved doing that back in the 90s. Movies, of course, actors and actresses, I enjoyed seeing so much. Of course, I was talking about Quentin Tarantino, but I was a big Robert Rodriguez fan as well. Will Smith. No, not Will Smith. Kevin Smith. Keep my wife's name out your mouth. So, but yeah, Kevin Smith, a great 90s director that I loved watching out. 90s was when I found out about who directors really were. So, the Steven Spielbergs and the George Lucases and the Quentin Tarantinos and the Martin Scorseses and, like I said, Kevin Smith and all that, Robert Rodriguez. These are the things I started learning about and I really enjoyed. In my high school and I guess in my middle school too, TLC was pretty popular. If you know TLC, and Lefty was Lopez. She would wear a condom in her glasses as like a shout out for safe sex. And I remember thinking that was so odd. I grew up in a very, decent sized, city, very, mix of races, urban area, so this was not because I lived in some like country bumpkin area, which a bunch of white people who were like, oh, that's so strange. Like, I know I grew up around all kinds of people. And I remember when the girls started wearing that in the class, like that was a thing for a while. I remember hammer pants. That was a huge thing. I remember my best buddy back growing up named Ryan. His mother was a seamstress, and she worked at some of the local news stations as a costume designer seamstress. And so she started doing like a side hustle back when the hammer pants was a I was making hammer pants for like every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the Southern Indiana, Louisville area. And so like his mom's like handiwork was all over our school. Even teachers, even some of the male teachers, Mr. Curry, for instance, if he's still around, got hammer pants and would wear hammer pants to school because that was such a thing. Then you had, let's see, what else was popular back then that I remember that was so big back then? Of course, Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson. All the kids started busting out the goth look. That was super popular. All the goth kids in my high school would like all congregate down in a certain area, and they would all be wearing black and pasty white makeup and looking like death warmed over. And that was like a thing for quite a while. And those are some of the, I guess, the fashions I can think of off the top of my head. There was a time where crisscross and some, I guess, groups, mostly crisscross, were wearing their clothes backwards. So we had a lot of kids wearing their clothes backwards in school. And so, yeah, I mean, there was just like a lot of things that is, these are all fond memories. And I don't really remember, there was, like I said, I went to a school with all different kinds of people's background, different religions, races, economic, backgrounds. And everybody, honestly, got along. We all got along with one another. My high school, my graduating class was close to 600. There was like 2,200 in my high school. It wasn't by any stretch a small school. It wasn't a giant school. But for Indiana, it was a pretty big school, for sure. So, I mean, we had a pretty diverse student body. And, everyone got along. Everybody intermingled. We had different groups of people all hung out. I mean, of course, just like anything in life, you have kind of like these little cliques that like stuck together predominantly, but you still would have everybody just get along just fine. And I was in theater and drama. I mean, that was probably the most diverse area in the school, quite frankly. And we all got along just fine. I mean, everybody was able to discuss things openly and honestly, and it was a very good time. I think those are the times I would look back fondly on that, a lot of things were able to be discussed with little to no resistance or aggressiveness or being berated or whatnot for feeling a certain way or for trying to understand certain things. And I mean, I remember that and thinking like, how great that was. And, nowadays you would probably be losing your job or having a completely miserable experience in school to have some of those more open and honest discussions with, classmates, friends, whatever, because people came at things in a different way. And I remember enjoying being able to discuss those things. In my high school, I was in a theater group called School Colors. And it was talking about people's experiences by, with your different backgrounds, different racial makeup backgrounds. And I remember, it was such a cathartic experience, I'm sure, for a lot of the student body, but also it was an opportunity for us to just discuss like real situations and turn them into, scenes or like plays, and to be able to discuss those things openly and honestly and be able to use that and real life experiences. And everybody felt safe to discuss, how they really had experienced some, tough things in life, because no matter how you slice it, we all go through some stuff. Everybody goes through tough times, some more than others for sure, some less than others for sure. But it was an opportunity to support one another, to build each other up, to hold each other accountable, to encourage one another. I just don't see that nowadays. So that's one of the reasons why I love the 90s, because, that was the name of the show. I love the 90s. For people who are still listening, you all can get a nice little crack at that, because I couldn't remember the name of the show. So that's the reason why I love the 90s, for that very reason. And so that's why I look back on the dark side of the 90s shows, because they're trying to paint everything out to be this, terrible time of, people like backwards, like you're puritanical, back in the olden days of like, restrictions and not open-mindedness, which is totally false. The fact of the matter was, back then, which is totally out of control now, is that they're pushing people to accept, regardless of where you stand on issues, instead of just let people live in their lives and, you just gravitate to whatever lifestyle you want. They're pushing it down people's throats. And if you don't want to gravitate towards a certain lifestyle, then somehow you're some sort of, Neanderthal stuck in like, BC times, before Christ times, or you're some backwards thinking hick. And it's just, that ain't the way it was. I mean, like I said, people intermingled with one another and fell in the groups of each other growing up easily, and no one was like looking to be offended. But I mean, that's the world we live in. So I do look back on the 90s as a very positive time, and I do enjoy the show like Dark Side of the 90s, because they do show so much of what was going on in the 90s. And so yeah, you have some talking heads or some commentators that just talk about nonsense because everything has to be hyperbolic, and everything has to be confrontational now, and everything has to be if you believe or feel a certain way about this kind of thing now, then should be feel like a terrible bad person. But if you can look past all that, the show's really good because they do have a lot of great nostalgic moments throughout that program. And I mean, I'm not a Beanie Baby fan whatsoever, but it was fascinating to see there was a whole subculture of Beanie Babies that was exploding in the 90s, which I of course know. I mean, we grew up in it, we saw it, but to hear the stories behind it was kind of interesting. So I find it. And the other thing is they have 90s music, 90s commercials, 90s news clips, 90s movies, and everything. They'll have clips throughout the show, and it just makes you go, man, you just pine for the days of yesteryear. So I don't know. I just kind of just been talking. I know like there's really no rhyme or reason, but I just want to let people know if you have Vice, are you able to access Vice TV or whatever? Dark Side of the 90s. Check it out. If you've seen it, what are your thoughts about it? And in general, what are your thoughts about the 90s? Good, bad, ugly, indifferent? What are some of, like I said, again, your favorite movies, music, fashion? What are some of the 90s things that really, caught you, you really remember, like the whole .com burst and, the ball dropping, right? As Y2K, all those type of things. I would love to hear about it. So until next time, thanks for listening, I guess, and kind of watching, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.